not done a wrap up in well over a year because I got into this phase where I just didn't really care about going over a whole month's worth of reading material, both because it was a really long filming process and I felt like I never really was proud of it, but also because I found myself being too pressured to read books within a certain time span. I really just wanted to give myself more freedom, but for some reason I've kind of been in the mood to film more wrap-ups lately. I've been watching them a lot. I love longer wrap-ups. I'm just gonna stop being self-conscious about whether or not these are good. Let's just jump into a big ol' stack of things I read in February. So I didn't realize I'd read this many things until I was getting them all together for this video. I read this stack plus some ebooks. I tried. So last month I had a couple of different reading things going on. So at the beginning of the month I decided I wanted to read a lot of books for Black history. And then towards the end of the month I did this romance binge. So that's a big chunk of what I'm going to talk about today, but I did read some books in between. I actually started off the month with a book on audiobook that I finished called A House in the Sky by Amanda Lindhout. This is a memoir about a young woman who loved traveling in her 20s and 30s, and this talks about how there's a time that she traveled to Somalia and then was kidnapped for ransom money, and then it delves into what happened in the year that she was kidnapped, the safe space she had to create for herself in her mind to be able to survive that, and then how she eventually got released. I was really concerned that there'd be a lot of Islamophobia in this, but I actually ended up really enjoying this because it talks about how she was able to forge a forgiveness for these people and there was no hostility toward the culture. The first half of this book is talking about how much she loves travel, how much she loves getting to know other countries' cultures, so it really sets it up for it to be maybe not the most glamorous. Still, I think I was able to leave this book kind of respecting her for knowing that there's a way to compartmentalize good people and bad people. I also thought the survival story was just gripping and haunting. She narrates this on audio, so it just felt very personal, and it's one of those memoirs that I could never imagine myself in her shoes, so it was just an incredible read. I ended up giving this 4.5 stars. Just lighter. You said lighter, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, top drawer right, far left. I ended up giving this 4.5 stars because I think the ending wrapped up too soon. Like, we got a lot of description of before she was captured, during her captivity, and then at the end she was just kind of like, then we went home and it was fine. So I wish there would have been more afterward about the things she's doing now, but I still think that as far as dark memoirs go about having to survive something that was so close to death, this was a really interesting read that did not villainize Islam. The next book that I read was for Black History Month, and this is called The Body's Not an Apology, The Power of Radical Self-Love by Sonia Renee Taylor. This is a nonfiction book all about body positivity, but what I mean by body positivity in this book's context is not necessarily just like fat acceptance. Sonia Renee Taylor describes bodies as any amount of different marginalizations that are visible, or maybe even not visible, like disabilities. So your body isn't just your size, your body is also your age, your race, your disability. And what she aims to do in this book is say that we need to accept our bodies to be able to accept other people's bodies, not just with our weight, but with every aspect of how we judge one another. And this is all encapsulated in her movement of radical self-love. So this is like a very short book just detailing that process and how to unlock those biases in yourself, and then how to have a better outlook on the world to be able to accept other people. I loved this book. This was written so wonderfully. It was both educational and well researched, but at the same time it was conversational, and there were little tidbits of side information on every page like this where you're able to just break the pace a little bit and have a little fun with it. I was planning on reading one chapter of this per day, but I ended up reading a lot of it in one sitting. I think this book would be fabulous if you were going to read it with a friend or with a book club, because every few pages there's a question area that allows you to reflect on yourself and how you've internalized different prejudices and how you can start undoing some of those things. One of my favorite parts of this book was Sonia talking about concern trolling, which is something that happens to me a lot being on the internet as a fat person, because people tell you like, oh, you're so unhealthy, you should do this and this and this. And then one of my favorite quotes of this book is saying, health is not a state that we owe the world. We are not less valuable, worthy, or lovable because we are not healthy. So that sort of fat shaming also ties into ableism, and the way that she's able to connect those dots and talk about how do we improve ourselves overall and not just in these little tiny facets. It's just awesome. And I like that this tackles issues from the angle of fix it within yourself before you fix it with other people. It definitely was a good resource to be able to locate what am I doing that I can stop, or what am I doing that I could help more with. The only thing that I wasn't a fan of in this book was that I don't know how feasible this is for every single person on earth to do, because I can't imagine like an 80-year-old Republican conservative person picking this up and going, yes, let's solve problems with self-love. I love the ideas of it. I don't know how feasible it is, so I'm not using it really as a resource to like fix our problems, but I definitely think it was a good step for me to see how am I contributing to promoting injustice that I can stop and be able to elevate others. But overall, I loved the book. I gave it 5 stars and I would highly recommend it. The next book I read was Queen of Air and Darkness, Our Lord and Savior. This is the final book in the Dark Artifices trilogy by Cassandra Clare. If you don't know, the first book is called Lady Midnight. It's this series about shadow hunters set in LA, and there's family politics and world politics. I feel like there's either 2 camps with it. There's people who haven't read it and don't care, and there's people who have read it. So I don't feel like I need to go into more detail. I'm not a major fan of this series. It's not my favorite. I loved Cassandra Clare when I was a teenager, and now I'm just kind of sticking around because I love the characters in them, but it's not my favorite world to be in. My main thing I loved about this book is that it involves so many characters from the previous series that I was obsessed with. So anytime that I found myself not really caring about Julia, just combined Emma and Julian or Emma, it did fall back quite heavily on those characters we were already familiar with, so it was nice and fun to be able to see them again. I listened to this book on audiobook, which I tried doing for book 1, and that ended up being a miserable experience because you were just getting established with the world, meeting characters for the first time, so it was confusing me. But by the time I was at the 3rd book, I knew everyone, I knew what was happening, so it was a really good time. I liked the audiobook a lot. One other thing though, I kept putting down the audiobook to look at the book because there are pictures! YA publishers, catch on. This was amazing. I loved seeing those. I would say my lasting impression of this book is that I was expecting I wouldn't like it because I'm typically someone that when there's a series that follows like 10 characters, I'm probably only gonna like one of them and I'm only gonna want to read that one person's perspective. But I found myself in this book enjoying every perspective, which I think is a huge win because I didn't skip any of these. I definitely have my favorites, like I would prefer to read about Kit and Ty or Christina, Kieran, and Mark over Julian and Emma, which is ironic that the main characters were my least favorite in this book, but still, I got to know the characters a lot better in this one. I wouldn't say the Blackthorns are my favorite characters in the Shadowhunter world, but I did enjoy their story. I don't think that the ending was like too convenient or unrealistic or anything. I really didn't have a problem with it like some other people did. However, Cassandra Clare always does this thing where after the end of the book has happened and like the falling action is done, she keeps the book going for like another 100 pages. And I was like, just end it, Cassie. So the end of this book, even though it's the end of a trilogy, it still ended on a cliffhanger. Like, what? The way that she's crafted her world is just, she has 30 storylines going at once and they're always continuing, so this book didn't even leave you in a satisfying place. It was like, alright, this one action's done, but here's 4 other subplots I'm gonna throw at you, and then we won't solve them until like 2030 when the next book comes out. But I'm not that mad about it because I think it's a good tactic to get you to read into her future series. One thing I forgot to mention is that the whole second part of this book is like this crazy spoilery thing I can't talk about, but I loved the second part of this book and the world we got to explore there. That was really smart of Cassandra Clare, so I loved that part of it. Again, if that happens in the next series, it's gonna be a lot of tea. So I think I ended up giving this like 4 stars. This isn't like a 6 of Crows series that's just like so close to my heart, but I think it was really fun. I would recommend the series. I mean, if you're willing to read the 10 books that go before this, but I had a fun time reading it and I'm not gonna sit here and say I didn't. Okie dokie, the next book I read, I have been reading since January, so I finally finished it. It was Life After Life by Kate Atkinson, which is an adult literary fiction book about this woman named Ursula who was born in the 1910s. This book just follows Ursula growing up in England, but the catch of this book is anytime that Ursula dies, she's reborn and begins her life again from day 1. So her entire childhood, she would get into accidents or she would get sick with something and she would die. But then when she's reborn, she's installed with this new instinct that tells her, don't do that thing that killed you in your previous life. So then she's able to live past the point that she had died previously, whether that's avoiding a certain window she'd fallen out of or avoiding a person that would have gotten her sick with airborne illness. And that all continues up until World War II, where she lives different lives going to Germany, she lives different lives working in England. So I would say the first half of this book is more so of a linear timeline of her childhood, and then the last half of this book kind of jumps between her different lifestyles that she had between different lives, about how she coped with the war, the different roles she served there, and then eventually the prologue of this book is her attempting to kill Hitler. It's really a wild ride, and I think the entire book I was waiting for myself to figure it out. Like, I thought this book was sort of a puzzle I would get to unlock and see, is she gonna kill Hitler? Like, is this thriller that she's gonna save the world? But I think this book is more so just the exploration of the theme. If you could redo your life, if you had unlimited chances to do something and to make change, how would you explore that? So I don't think this book necessarily has the goal of prevent World War II. It's just, would you try and strive to be a better person if you could live the ultimate life? Or maybe not even a better person, or just like, what avenues of your life would you explore if that were a possibility? I thought this book was beautiful. The first half of this book I read in basically one sitting just because it was such an interesting concept. I love her characterization of someone that was more reserved and really didn't do a whole lot, but then seeing how her life affects her the more that she dies and is reborn, the sort of intuition that's born within her. The middle of this and toward the end of this did start to lag because so much of the war, you were introduced to new characters and that weren't really fleshed out as well as her childhood best friends and her family had been, so it was harder to get a grasp on what was happening. So toward the end of this, that's why this took like 2 months to read, because I was just having such a hard time getting through what plotline was what, so I think it got a little bit too muddled jumping between all her different lives. But I do think the ending of this was really strong. I guess it was just relief that I was done, but I liked how this ended off. I liked how it made me think throughout the entire book, and I think the writing style was amazing. So even though this lagged a bit in the middle, I still think it's quite worth the read. I ended up giving this book 4 stars. The next book I picked up was also for Black History Month. It is The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. This book follows a young black girl in an Ohio town in the 1940s, and this talks about how at the time, or I guess now, whiteness is revered as the beauty standard, and so it follows this young black girl dealing with a lot of dysmorphia over her skin color, particularly her eye color, how she longed to have blue eyes. And so this is sort of an interestingly formatted novel because it follows young girls that are her age at the time witnessing her, and it goes in different perspectives around her, showing her life, and then it goes into the backstory of her parents and how that shame is almost inherited. It's a beautifully developed story that does deal with a lot of dark topics like domestic abuse and sexual assault, but the way that this narrative unfolded, the commentary that Toni Morrison had, like, if you can see I have so many tabs in this book. I think this book is relevant the time it was published, I think it was relevant in the 40s, and I definitely think it's still relevant now. The way that Toni Morrison writes is unlike anything I've ever read, and that's a huge reason why I'm definitely planning on picking up more from her, because the way that she writes, it's like you use the least amount of words to pack the most amount of punch. This is like a book that you'd read for an English class where you could locate how every single word on the page has its own symbolism and meaning. But it was never tiresome to read this. It was just this effortless consuming of language that I was left being like, I could never write like this. This is so beautiful. I gave this instant 5 stars. I thought this book was beautiful and important and powerful and sad. I highly, highly, highly recommend it if you can deal with topics like domestic abuse, animal abuse, rape, pedophilia. I certainly plan on rereading this in the future because it was just fabulous. The next book I read was also for Black History Month. I picked up a romance book called A Princess in Theory by Alyssa Cole. This is the first book in a quartet, I believe, called the Reluctant Royals series. Alyssa Cole is a black author, and both of these characters, the love interest, the side character, and the main character, are all black. So this book follows a woman named Naledi who is a graduate student at this science college in New York City. She's getting by with very little money. She's sort of scraping to survive, and one day she starts getting emails that she assumes are spam from the prince of the Solo saying, "Hello, you are my betrothed. Please respond with your social security and identifying information so that we can be betrothed." And she thinks it's baloney, but then this prince ends up having a business meeting in New York, so he goes there and he ends up meeting her, and it's all about how she doesn't know he's a prince, but he found her. I don't know how much to reveal about the synopsis because there's a lot of family politics and culture that plays into this. I feel like I don't even need to say this at this point, but the diversity in this book was awesome. Alongside all the characters being black, there was also lesbian representation. There was a disabled side character who was in a wheelchair. The major thing that I'll mention that disturbed me about this book is that there's a trope that Prince Thabiso almost like stalks her. He shows up at her workplace, pretends to be her co-worker. He goes by a fake name for like half the book because he doesn't tell her his real identity. And it's up to the point where they like get sexually involved while he's still being untruthful to her about who his identity is. And I thought that was not well done at all. I wasn't a fan of that. The pacing of this was also a bit slower in the first half, so I ended up getting it on audiobook, which I typically don't do with romance, but I thoroughly enjoyed this on audio, especially when you get to the last half of this book where there's a setting change and you go to the prince's home city and you get to see his side of the story and see his family and see the culture there. It was so interesting and I loved that part of this book. Another thing I loved about this book is just the main character. I loved Naledi. I think that she was so empowering and strong and she fought for herself. She's smart and she's confident, and I love that this author is not afraid to challenge any of the bad things that happen. So for example, after she does find out that this prince has been lying to her, there's a lot of discussion about that and there's a lot of unpacking why that wasn't right. So I think that even though that trope exists, it was handled well. So I love the inclusivity packed into this, and I would love to read the rest of the series to see what else we have, because I know that there's a novella in this series that is set from the lesbian side character, who I loved in this book, by the way. I can't wait to read that one. And that's after the second book, I think, so I think I'm gonna read them in order, but I would love to follow more of these characters. I would love to read more from this author. I really enjoyed this book, even though the first half was kind of a struggle to get through because of the pacing and the trope I didn't really like, but still I thought by the end this was so much fun. I liked how it addressed topics, and yeah, it was just cutesy, so I would recommend this one. The next book I read is another non-fiction book for Black History Month, and that was This Will Be My Undoing by Morgan Jerkins. This is a feminist collection of essays that talk about intersections of feminism in America, so it goes into pop culture, feminism, Black history, misogyny, and racism. As you can see, once again, I had quite a field day adding tabs to this. I really enjoyed this book. Some of the topics that are discussed in this book are Black women's hair, Beyonce, dating and sex life, the movement of Black girl magic, and the main thing that I loved about this book was that it was quite anecdotal. So although this does offer a really good commentary on American politics and American feminism, it's all grounded in backstory from Morgan, talking about how she grew up or different experiences she's had that really anchor the story in personal experience and make it that much more real. This is certainly a book that is by and about Black women, but I think that anyone of any race or gender could pick up. I loved reading this book back to back with The Bluest Eye because these talk a lot about the same topics, about body acceptance. There's even references to The Bluest Eye in this book because there's a lot of discussion about the ways that Black women have to appear physically and able to make white people more comfortable, and that was both with hair, that was with like bleaching products, so it goes into a lot of discussion about that. And I think once again these two paired together really just nailed that hammer on the head. What? My only minor complaint with this is that some of the essays were pretty lengthy and I feel like they would meander a bit because, like I said, they were a good mix of personal story and then also some explanation and more political commentary almost. But with that, sometimes it would go back and forth, go off on other paths, and I felt like I would have preferred more concise, shorter essays for each small chunk. This is definitely going to be something that I recommend if anyone wants to hear about more Black women's issues in America. And this could be a great resource for Black women who want to be seen and heard, but also for white people to know more about the things that we should be aware of that we don't have to deal with. Just to be aware of that and learn what we can do better. So I did give this book 4.5 stars, taking off half a star for the book's pacing, but the content itself is priceless. I loved it. So here started my little fiasco with reading adult romance. I will be brief with some of these because I want to do a separate wrap-up / review type video for all the romances that I've read. The first one that I read was called The Accidental Beauty Queen by Terry Wilson, which is about this woman who is an elementary school librarian but also is twin sisters with a pageant queen. So they both go to Florida to go to one of her pageants, but our main character Charlotte is just there for the free hotel to go to Harry Potter World. So she is very much nerdy, loves reading, not really interested in beauty, until the night before the pageant her twin sister has an allergic reaction to something, her face swells up, and she ends up not being able to compete in the pageant that her mother had won before she passed away. And so she wants to be able to continue on that legacy, and the only other way that can happen is if her twin sister performs in the pageant for her. So it's all about how they have to trade places, and she's this very awkward girl thrown into the limelight. There's a small romantic side plot of this character with one of the judges. I'm not really gonna remember this book as a romance book that I loved and I thought the relationship was sweet, but the inner monologue of this, the pace of it, the way it was written, the themes of this book, I thought it was so cute. I thought this book was hilarious and fun. It unpacks a lot of discussion about pageant girls and some misconceptions, so I think it was really beautifully done that way. I gave this book 3.5 stars because it was a really fun time. It just wasn't really anything that would stick with me lastingly, and I had a couple of small problems with like disordered eating and other smaller writing style issues with things I wish would have been touched more on, but I still think if you want something you can read in a day that's very quick, it has dogs, it has Harry Potter references, you will love this book. The next book I read was an ebook that was also for Black History Month, but it was another romance. I read Fit by Rebecca Weatherspoon, which is a novella, I think. It's very short. This book follows a woman who wants to lose weight, and so she enrolls in a gym with a trainer who is also into BDSM. So no exaggeration, it's about this woman and her trainer having training sessions, body positivity and empowerment and exercising, but then at the end of the day they're also smashing. I will say up front, that's probably my major complaint about this book, is that I don't understand the BDSM and the gym, how those go together. It was slightly awkward that he was using his clients as his dom sub, but that was really the only thing I got stuck on, because otherwise I thought this book was wonderful. The main character is Chinese and plus sized, and once again this book is written by an author who knows what she's doing as far as writing healthy relationships. Every time that the male character does something questionable or says something over the line, the main character calls him out and there's discussion about it. So I think that this book is really mature. This book portrayed such a healthy BDSM relationship. I'm not a fan of BDSM, there's no tea there, I just don't prefer that in books. I don't really reach for erotica, but I did like this book. I thought it was very soft, the guy was very respectful, and I loved that they had this relationship outside of sex that was, even though it was exercising, it was very soft. Like they would go for walks and he would bring his dog with him, so it was really fun to read. I said I would just do a short review for this book, so I gotta stop raving about it, but I did really enjoy that book. I gave it 4 stars. I just don't plan on continuing that series because I wasn't really sold on the concept of gym trainers and BDSM. I would love to read more from that author though, because I thought the voice in it was hilarious. I loved how soft it was, and I thought it was just buckets of fun. The next book I completed was another book for Black History Month. I finally picked up Americanah by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, which is a book that is about 2 Nigerians who immigrate to other countries to go to school. Both of them dream about going to America, but only the woman is accepted to do that, and so it's about her going off and having to find a way to survive, working, going to school, living there illegally. The male character goes off to England and he's dealing with the same issues about having to find illegal work and staying in the country just to be able to survive. And the book follows them for about a decade until they both decide to move back to Nigeria, and they're reuniting, and just explores where their lives went while they were separated, and especially since this book predominantly follows our female character, Ifemelu, how her experience was in America as a Black woman. My biggest gripe with this book was that it was just so dry. There was a good chunk of this book that I did thoroughly enjoy, and it had me gripped. The first 100 pages are difficult to get into because there's escalating political happenings in Nigeria. I also found myself vastly preferring reading in the female point of view than the guy, Obenze. I just thought that her storyline was a lot more interesting. The things that she was dealing with and the characters we knew were a lot more familiar and easy to understand. The audiobook saved my life listening to this because I don't think I would have been able to finish it as quickly as I did had I not been listening to it. And even then I still had to skip a couple chapters of Obenze's perspective just because I feel like I didn't care about him like 400 pages into the book where we hadn't even seen him at all. But despite my struggles being able to get through this, I do think it offered a really amazing commentary on what it's like to be Black in America, and specifically the differences between being an African American who was born there versus an African immigrant, so you're an African living in America. The distinctions between that and the different circumstances that this main character is involved in, I think were really eye-opening and well written. I especially love that Ifemelu developed a blog to talk about this, and so a lot of this book involves those blog entries that discuss the different injustices that she's had to go through. So I liked hearing about Ifemelu in America and how that change was so abrupt from living in Nigeria, which is a Black majority country, but really nothing else about the book was exciting for me. And I know the point of this book is Ifemelu and Obenze being sort of together, like they were in a relationship in college and now they're coming back together in Nigeria 10 years later, but I just found myself not really caring about their relationship. So by the end of this book, I wasn't really invested in whether or not they would get back together, even though I enjoyed those scenes between them reuniting and talking and discussing things that have happened over the years. I don't know, something about this book just didn't quite grab me with the direction the author was going, so I ended up giving this 2.5 stars. It wasn't my favorite, but I do appreciate the commentary it offered about blackness in America. The next book I read was The Unhoneymooners by Christina Lauren. You can see like the shift in my face. This book was so good. I'm not gonna go off about it too much because I want to do a full review in my next video about my romance reviews, but this book is about a woman named Olive who's going to the wedding of her twin sister. At this wedding, the best man is the brother of the groom, who is her arch enemy, and she despises him. But while at this wedding, she and her arch enemy are the only two people that don't eat the seafood buffet, which ends up making the entire wedding violently ill. So there is a non-refundable honeymoon up for grabs, so Olive and Ethan are nominated to go and take it for them so that they can at least take advantage of this travel time in Hawaii. So it's about them despising one another but going to Hawaii for a week, and this book is an enemies to lovers feast. I loved this. Christina Lauren always creates characters that are just so messy and relatable and fun. The dialogue is so candid. I was giggling out loud reading this. Really, my only problem with this is that the first half of the book was fun, and the last half of the book, when they go back to the US, I know my ass didn't just imply that Hawaii isn't part of the US, became really unnecessarily angsty and weird. But once again, you see all my tabs. I thought the relationship was so much fun, so sweet, such a great progression, and I'm thoroughly convinced Christina Lauren can do no wrong. So I highly recommend pre-ordering this. I highly recommend getting your hands on this. This comes out on May 14th. Juliet Ferrar's birthday is the 18th. Buy this for her birthday for yourself and enjoy it. It's wonderful. The next book I read was a poetry collection called If My Body Could Speak by Blythe Baird. I've previously read one of Blythe Baird's books that's currently out of print now, so I think this edition was just all of her poetry combined into one like official publication. So this is all feminist poetry from one of my favorite slam poets on YouTube. She talks mostly about eating disorders and rape, so if those are things that you're sensitive about, I would definitely steer away from this. And I think my main takeaway from this is that I discovered Blythe in 2015, and that's also when I read her first book, and I gave that an instant 5 stars. But I think since then I've read so much more poetry, especially poetry that is about feminism and even from women of color about feminism, that I just found had a lot more depth to it. I think that's just a very polite way of saying that my standards have risen. So although I love Blythe's writing style, I love when I read poems that I've heard her perform, I can hear her voice in my mind. She has such great hard-hitting lines that I think are iconic. So I think if you're just getting into poetry, you might really like this, but if you're an aficionado, it might be a little bit dry. Even if you're not a fan of poetry, I still say look her up on YouTube and listen to her speak, because she just talks so eloquently, and I like how unforgiving she was about addressing all her trauma in her life. So I don't want to sit here and say, oh, your book was bad because you haven't had it hard enough or anything like that, but I did really like it. I just had to give it a 4 stars because it wasn't as mind-blowing as it was when I first read some of those poems back in 2015. The next book I read was 99% Mine by Sally Thorne. I'm gonna just keep it real with you, Chief. I hated this book. This is the author of The Hating Game, which is one of my favorite books ever. Where is it? The Hating Game. You can see The Hating Game is like absurdly annotated. I gave this book 5 stars, loved it. But then reading this, it's like it's not even the same author, and I am so appalled. This is about a woman named Darcy who doesn't like staying in one place, so she's a traveling photographer. But at the beginning of this book, her grandmother dies, and her grandmother's last wish was for her house to be renovated, and then they sell it. So Darcy has to stick around while her childhood best friend named Tom renovates the house. Darcy's been in love with Tom for her whole life, but Tom is her twin brother's best friend, and also Tom has been recently engaged, so he's been off limits until this time that they're stuck in this house together. He's single and free for the first time ever. So it's all about her literally throwing herself at his feet to get with him, and him being like, oh, we can't, and there's like no reason why not. The writing style of this was completely unreadable. The romance in this was not paced well at all. I just didn't even understand what was happening in this, and it was a mess. There's a lot of overprotectiveness in this and gross lines about like no one else can have you and I want you to be 100% mine. I'm just baffled that this book was published because it was garbage, and I feel so bad because the publisher sent me a copy, but I don't know how this got past an editor because it was not good. The only thing that redeemed this book, and the reason why you see some sticky tabs, are because the guy in this book is very soft. I just don't know what I was reading. It was wild. I just was so confused at this book. I think I wanted to love how strong Darcy was, but she was just so weird, and that's from me. Like, I'm weird, but this was just on another level. I didn't understand a single page of it. I'm so sorry, Sally Thorne. The next book I read was actually a DNF. I read about half of Meet Cute by Helena Hunting, which is an arc of a book that's about this woman who is an attorney. Back when she was in law school, she was friends with a man named Dax, who was a guy who was previously an actor in her favorite childhood TV show, or I guess teenage years TV show. She was really infatuated with him. He ended up betraying her toward the end of their college career, and so she hasn't seen him in 5 years, but she's harbored this intense hatred for him until one day his parents die and he needs her law firm to go over different stuff with their will, and they end up reuniting, and she has to come to terms with being friends with him again because he needs help raising his 13-year-old sister, and she's basically the only person he has. This book wasn't miserable like anything else, but I just found myself by the middle point of this book really not vibing with the writing style of it. It was so much telling and not showing, and the romance was really dry. The characters were such robotic characters because they didn't have any inner monologue that talked about their feelings or their reactions to things. It was strictly just like, I do this, I think this. And this book was a lot more family based than I was hoping. It was basically just like a custody battle with this romance thrown in on the side, which really wasn't very ethical in the first place. So it just wasn't for me at all. I ended up passing it on to my friend, so hopefully she enjoys it more than I did. I would say you would probably like it more than I did if you enjoy books with lighter romance, but I just ended up DNFing it and giving it 2 stars because I was not a big fan. So next I did a 24-hour readathon, which you can see in a vlog I'll link down below. So I read a lot of short books, the first of which being 6 Lethargies by Keaton Henson. I'm gonna just talk about this briefly because I doubt any of you own this or even want to read it, but Keaton Henson is one of my favorite artists. This book chronicalizes how he wrote a score for the symphony, and the 6 different songs in this score talk about descending into depression and anxiety and then how to recover from that. In this book there's photographs of it, there's essays describing how he wrote it and all the different things that went into the production of it, and then there's also 6 poems that go along with those 6 different movements. This one's my favorite. It's about the chaos stage, and so it just says all is lost. So I love this book. I gave it 5 stars because I love Keaton Henson's poetry and his writing and his photographs, but this score is not available online. It's only in person, so I have not seen it, and I don't know if I ever will. So it was really hard to read something that gives you the behind the scenes on something you've never experienced or heard before. So that was just a little bit awkward. Hopefully he'll release this on Spotify or something, or even as like a vinyl, and then I'll be able to match the music with the experience. But I still thought this was beautiful, and I gave it 5 stars because I would die for Keaton Henson. Moving onward, I read a manga. It's called Satoko Nada. This is a story about these 2 young women who go to college in New York City. One of them is from Saudi Arabia, one of them is from Japan, and it's about them cohabitating, and that gives them a lot of different opportunities to talk about their cultures, and especially because this is from a Japanese point of view, there's a lot of questions about what it's like to be a Muslim woman, and it addresses a lot of stereotypes about Muslim women. I gave this book a full 5 stars. It was so cute. This book only has like 100 ratings on Goodreads, which is a crime because it was so funny. This is told in the comedy style where there's only 4 panels on each page, and so it was so short and punchy and adorable. I wanted to be friends with these girls by the end of this book. There's such a good discussion of cultural difference, and especially how fitting in America affected them both. My only thing that I questioned throughout this book, and something I saw other reviewers mention, is that this asks a lot of naive and stereotypical questions about Muslim women, like, do you guys have arranged marriages? Another review I saw said that they were disappointed that that was talked about because it was something that was outdated. It was definitely something that I questioned during my reading reading because it just felt like she was asking a lot of intrusive questions. But I'm obviously not Muslim. One Muslim review I saw does not speak for everyone, so take from that what you will. Still, I really enjoyed this book just because it offers such a cute friendship between these two people. There's another volume coming out this year that I have pre-ordered, so I can't wait to read more of their story, and I need you to go pick this up today. It's in Barnes & Noble. You have no excuse not to. And the final book that I read in February was a graphic novel called Snot Girl by Brian Lee O'Malley and Leslie Hung. This is about a young woman who is a fashion blogger in LA. She ends up meeting a girl at a party who she's really fascinated with, but then ends up accidentally murdering, or so she thinks, because then this same woman reappears a couple days later, not mentioning anything about what happened. So it's almost this thriller about, like, did she kill her, did she not? All from the backdrop of being someone from LA and trying to maintain an image. So a lot of the art in this book is cutesy LA, like very bright colors, everyone looks good 100% of the time. You're like hiding all of your bad blood with people, just being fake. I thought this book was adorable. I loved the art, I loved the characters. My only issue with it was I think this book doesn't give you enough explanation of the actual murder mystery happening, even though that's the main plot of the book. It kind of skips over that and deals with other events happening, even though the main issue inside the book is whether or not this murder is actually occurring. I think that's just something you'll have to keep reading to find out. I ended up giving this 4 stars. I think I've seen a lot of people rating this low because they had more of an issue with not enough being explained in this volume, but this art style is one of my new favorites of all time. I think this character is so beautiful. I love her, and I can't wait to read volume 2. I'm already hunting for it. I just have no idea what's happening, so clearly I have to read on. So that was my first lengthy wrap up of this year. I know when I do sit down videos, especially discussing my thoughts about book, I'm more serious and I don't like tell funny jokes. For some reason I kind of default to being more serious when I'm reviewing, which I used to feel really bad about. I think that's why I stopped doing these, is because I was like, I'm not funny when I sit on the ground and just talk about books. But I think when I'm in this mindset of like, here's my bullet points, here's how I feel about these, I'm not really focused on like, how can I make a joke out of this? So if you're interested in hearing like more specific thoughts on these books as I read them, I do have reading vlogs that I do for pretty much every book that I read. I don't know, I feel like I always ask for feedback and no one really has any complaints, but let me know if you enjoyed this style of wrap-ups. I would love to hear your thoughts about any of these books that I've read, or if you're looking forward to reading any of them, or if you read any good books in February. So just leave a comment down below, interact with me, say hello. Hope you're all having a wonderful life. I'm gonna go grab some dinner and I will see you whenever my next video appears in your feed. Goodbye!